Hello, and welcome back to my Shrek Deep Dive series, where I analyze the characters, themes, and development of the Shrek franchise. And today we are going to be talking about Shrek the Third, one of the worst rated movies in Shrek's history. I remember growing up having this movie on repeat as I fell asleep every night. This was due largely in part to my family not being able to afford cable, and this being one of the only DVDs that I had that had an autoplay feature. I've always been the type of kid who liked having something on the TV while I slept, so I didn't feel so alone. Like the characters on screen were enough company to restrain the monsters under my bed and in my closet. But nonetheless, I remember really loving this movie and considering it a good contender against Shrek 2 due to its high energy comedy and fantastical finale. It's been a good 10 plus years since I saw the movie, and now having watched it at this point in my analysis journey, I could say my perspective has certainly shifted, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm structuring this analysis the same way I did my Shrek 2 video. Again, I will start with production. It's the most consistent thing I can report on as I'm not a financial analysis, therefore, I cannot expand upon anything that Wikipedia gives me. I can simply just relay the facts in an entertaining way. From production, I'm going to introduce the themes and overarching goals of the movie before we get into the meat of the plot and scene by scene analysis. This is the obligatory spoiler alert. This video will have heavy spoilers for Shrek, Shrek 2, and Shrek the Third. Anyways, Shrek the Third is the franchise's attempt at the logical continuation of Shrek and Fiona's story. They've gotten married, met the in laws, and are working through their daily lives, building up routines and managing expectations of themselves quite well. But there are two monkey wrenches that are thrown in for the sake of this movie. King Harold dies, leaving Shrek to be the new king, and Fiona confesses that she's pregnant. And throughout the movie, we follow the consequences of these two events. And the Shrek team does a fantastic job at guiding these plot threads through the lens of parodying other genres and tropes, keeping with the now classic Shrek format of subverting and expanding upon viewer expectations. I hesitate on saying the team drew inspiration from King Arthur legends, because while it borrows names like Artie and Merlin in this movie, the film sidesteps traditional Arthurian storytelling in favor of comedic subversions like Artie's teenage insecurities and Merlin's California hippie eccentricities. There are, however, some similar themes and tropes to Arthurian legends, like the reluctant king trope in both Shrek and Artie, and overcoming familial slash institutional ascribed self doubt. But then there's the exaggerated valley accent all the students seem to have, and we understand this isn't going to be a sword in the stone kind of medieval. In the 10 minutes we are in Worcestershire, we see high school drama parodies with cliche cliques, pompous clubs, and classic coming of age story of the loner kid who's actually the main character. And of course, it's all flipped on its side. The students mix historically inaccurate medieval terms with early 2000s slang, like totally with. Cheerleaders chants, "Does thou thinkest I can make it stop? Me is thinko." Blah blah blah. I can't do that chant very well. I can barely even hear them, but it's funny. And it is genuinely funny to see the creative mixing of modern high school tropes with medieval technology, like the school bus carriage or the student driver being told to ease up on the reins before the carriage speeds off screen. It's so clever and fun. Along with the reluctant leader, fairy tale trope, Charming and his crew are a parody of the over the top villain team ups found in many superhero movies and TV shows. And the princesses storming the castle to rock music after a faux feminist montage is a sharp parody of classic Hollywood action tropes. Along with parody, Shrek the Third continues the themes of self acceptance and love from the first two movies and expands upon the question posted by Shrek 2: what happens after the happily ever after? With Shrek now having to navigate the idea of fatherhood and what that means in terms of being an ogre, a prince, and the person he is underneath all the titles. However, despite Shrek the Third's offering a more cohesive mix of genres than Shrek 2's eccentric mix mash, there is something lacking in the third movie's execution compared to its predecessors. The producers and writers aimed to capture and reinvigorate the magic of the first two movies. They did a few things very right. The action, the animation, the attention to visual detail, they are all testimony to the continued growth and excellence of the animators at Pacific Data Images. The writers also course corrected their reliance on reference jokes throughout the movie, which was a major weakness in the comedy of Shrek 2. However, I find that Shrek the Third is a subpar continuation of the franchise. It has moments of pure brilliance, but many more moments that could have been fantastic if they weren't undercut by tonal inconsistencies, which are contributed by a lack of trust in the story's emotional core. This won't be the boldest stance out there on this movie. In my opinion, falls very much in with the public consensus, But I know I could still add some clarity and nuance to the discussion that already exists. It's my hope in the course of this video to uncover and analyze and discuss what is missing to figure out what anchors this movie as just good and clever instead of letting it soar to the ranks of masterclass like its predecessors. And to start the exploration, let's dive into production. Shrek the Third started production in 2004 following the roaring success of Shrek 2. It was announced alongside plans for Shrek 4 and 5, even though the latter wouldn't be released until July 2026, which is currently more than a year away from now. A quick sidebar, Shrek 5's original idea was to showcase Shrek's origin, which is heavily hinted at in Shrek the Third. We see a lot of moments of him and other characters experiencing high school or mentioning high school in their childhood, which wasn't really mentioned in any of the other two movies. It's kind of like they were preparing for it now. But with the mixed critical reviews for both Shrek the Third and Shrek Forever After, the DreamWorks team thought it would be best to find a better narrative direction from what they had previously planned. So if that means we see a Shrek origin story or not, I guess we'll find out in the coming year. Shrek the Third would be released to theaters on May 18th, 2007, after its premiere at the Man Village Film Festival on May 6th of that year. It was the fourth highest grossing film of 2007, netting $813 million on a $160 million budget, compared to Wicked's current, as I'm recording this video, gross of $681 million on a $150 million budget. Which is insane, by the way, because the Wicked team planted thousands if not hundreds of thousands of tulips 5 years ago for the movie. I can't imagine that not being half the budget in just time investment alone. Anyways, while this movie didn't net the studios any more Oscar nominations, the film did win the People's Choice Award for Best Family Movie of 2007, and Cameron Diaz, Mike Myers, and Eddie Murphy were that year's nominees for the Children's Choice Awards for Best Voice Actor, with Murphy taking the blimp. The movie would obviously see the three actors reprising their roles as Fiona, Donkey, and the titular Shrek, along with Antonio Banderas, Julie Andrews, John Cleese, Larry King, and Rupert Everett all reprising their roles as well. Then up-and-coming superstar Justin Timberlake also joined the team along with Eric Idle, voicing Arthur Pendragon and Merlin respectively. DreamWorks hired some new screenwrites for this addition to the franchise, bringing on Jeffrey Price and Peter S. Seaman, who worked with producers Aaron Warner, who helped direct the first two movies, and Chris Miller, who worked on the first movie as a story artist, then on the second as head of story. This would be the first movie without Andrew Adamson as a working director, though he did act as a story consultant throughout the movie's production, and he's credited as one of the writers of the story. The movie was met with decidedly mixed reviews, with many critics and viewers either praising its comedic moments or criticizing its lack of emotional depth that was so prevalent in its predecessors, which is about the same boat I'm in as well. This divide between comedy and emotional depth is mirrored in how the movie handles its characters, which brings us to an important structural issue. This is typically where I talk about character importance and how the movie distributes its roles of main secondary, plain secondary, and tertiary characters. However, the Shrek franchise seems to have a tradition of changing up how they distribute these titles from movie to movie. In the past, this framework was well thought out to ensure every character had a meaningful role. But in Shrek the Third, this balance is skewed, impacting the story's overall cohesion. But without further ado, let's get into it. With no traditional fairy tale book being open to the story of Fiona's curse, the opening scene of this movie immediately sets it apart from its predecessors while also closely tying it to the second movie by introducing us to Prince Charming as he appears to be on another adventure to rescue a princess. I'm now realizing that this is a brilliant stroke of writing, as the majority of the conflict of this movie is directly linked to the actions and consequences of the second movie. Another brilliant move by the writers is how the audience expectations are subverted almost immediately when the camera pans back to reveal Charming on a children's broomstick horse, with a medieval green screen rushing behind him and coconuts clapping off stage like a scene straight out of Monty Python. Because it is a scene straight out of Monty Python. Eric Idle was actually very mad about this. But Charming, he's no courageous knight. He's a washed up actor, a phony, blaming all his misfortune on Shrek. And we get a taste of the fractured mental state he's in, shifting from grandiose bravado to a deep sadness to blood red rage as he remembers the delusions of grandeur his mother instilled in him. And it feels truly sinister, until a newspaper flies in his face and the malice is halved. I'll be getting more pissy about these tonal undercuts surrounding Charming, but this one is fine because the mouse picks right back up as he promises no one will get in his way, and we get a foreshadow of the king's death in the newspaper. Again, those little details are just so good. I do love this opening. By introducing the villain and their point of view, while also reintroducing the subversion of viewer expectations in a succinct and funny fashion, is such a well crafted way to hook the audience in. It leaves us with so many questions. Why is Charming back? What's he planning? And mockingly, what could this prissy little freak even possibly do? It's a setup designed to lull us into underestimating him, making his later actions all the more shocking. And I love this subtle foreshadowing and the small attention to details like Charming's medallion necklace representing his mother's happily ever after potion. They're all just so good and clever. After being heckled off stage by Gingy and company, Charming swears his revenge on Shrek and Fiona, and then we get our hero montage with Royal Pains by the Eels playing in the background. We see that Shrek and Fiona are playing the roles of king and queen while King Harold is sick. We see Shrek knight someone and accidentally hurt him. Then Shrek, with his ogre strength, prematurely sends off a voyaging ship, and in an attempt to ceremoniously break a wine bottle over the ship's hull, he chucks a bottle, splintering the side of the hull and ultimately sinking the ship. Hilarious. Then we get a Princess Diaries reference, and Shrek and Fiona get a wild Elizabethan era makeover. The outfits can't restrain their ogre bodies for very long, and a button pops off Shrek with such force it causes enough mayhem to set the building on fire. And this culminates to Shrek being ready to go home more than ever. And while Fiona is feeling the same, she is also trying to prep Shrek for her pregnancy reveal, and he's just not getting it. So she spells it out for him, and he is immediately terrified at the prospect. Then they get a call to the king's quarters as he is dying. There's so much to unpack in this montage, and I want to start back at Charming's introduction in the low budget play. In this scene, a person in Shrek costume comes on stage and the crowd starts cheering for him. This indicates how much has changed in Far, Far Away since the second movie. People like ogres now, or at least they don't discriminate against them like they did before. They cheer for Shrek and acknowledge him as their equal, and even their crown prince. And we see how Shrek has acknowledged this change as well. He's no longer afraid in big crowds of humans. He's uncomfortable with the position of power he's in and the customs he is forced to follow and perpetuate, but he's no longer terrified just to exist among them. It's a cool detail the writers and animators took into account, and it even calls back to the first movie when Shrek fights all of Duloc's knights and the crowd starts cheering for him. This scene indicates his natural charisma that comes from his candid behavior, and it kind of explains why Shrek seems more like an ass when he's lying to himself and others throughout the franchise. People gravitate towards his unabashed realness, and the implications of this are interesting to think about. This montage clearly defines the themes and tropes of the movie to the audience as well, with this not so subtle nod to Shrek's reluctant leader role, and Fiona hinting at her pregnancy and Shrek's very fearful response to the idea of fatherhood. And while he sputters out the first thing that comes to mind, the physical and messy inconveniences that babies provide, to discourage the idea to Fiona, he says something that's much more candid to his person after. Fiona asks, "Have you ever thought about having a family?" And he responds, "Right now, you're my family." And he says it in such a way that conveys both that he's getting used to that idea and that Fiona being in his life is more than he could have ever asked for, and is really touching. This montage, along with charming scenes, introduces the kind of humor in this movie. And here's where I'll say something a little controversial. Shrek the Third has better humor in it than Shrek 2. And before you crucify me in the comments, let me explain. Shrek 2 is currently funnier, and by far more quotable with many perfectly executed punchlines that make me laugh no matter how many times I see the movie. But Shrek 2 heavily relies on pop culture references for most of its jokes. The reliance of these jokes puts a time limit on their enjoyment. Shrek the Third, while still using pop culture references for some of its jokes, calls back to the first Shrek movie, with more physical gags and quick-witted dialogue among the characters. And also, a lot of the pop culture references in Shrek the Third are based on references from fairy tale tropes and royal romanticisms, not necessarily Y2K 90s and 80s era phenomenon that loses impact with every passing year. There's also a bit of meta comedy throughout the movie as well, and we can see that in the interesting subversion of expectations with the music choice for the montage itself. Whereas Shrek and Shrek 2 introduces us to our heroes with something upbeat and fun to get the sugar rushes going in the children audiences, Royal Pains is much more subdued, almost drab with its lyrics, and the music is almost instantly shoved to the background so the characters can talk. Compared to the first two movies, this montage sets a completely different tone for the rest of the movie to come. It's a fascinating choice, as the franchise seems to be poking fun at its own established tropes, like someone in their 30s laughing at their bold, naive younger self. This self awareness could have been a great comedic thread throughout the movie if the tone remained consistent. And I think this next scene with King Harold really captures what I mean about tonal inconsistencies. The next scene is King Harold's death, and it's a lot. Harold gives his final goodbyes. Fiona and Lillian are deeply emotional, and Shrek awkwardly bids farewell. Before he dies the first time, he asks Shrek to get closer as they have business to talk about. But before he can say anything, he slumps over, supposedly lifeless. The cast and animators deliver candid, well crafted reactions to his death, adding gravitas to the scene. And Donkey's banter with Puss about his hat after the king wakes up, again, is genuinely silly. When Shrek kneels down, his awkwardness shifts out of him, and he starts familiarly addressing Harold as Dad. This is a fun callback to the second movie when Harold is tricking Shrek to the woods to be assassinated, and he tells him to call him Dad. And it's a clever way to show how the characters and their feelings for each other have evolved from that movie. Harold tells Shrek that he and Fiona are to run the kingdom from now on as they are next in line. Shrek is very much not into this and begs for Harold to tell him anyone else who might qualify and he'll go get them. Harold dies before he can spit it out, and again, the acting and animation are so good. And then Harold comes back to life again by eating a fly by Puss and Donkey, and both of them look very disgusted. It's pretty funny. Harold tells Shrek of Fiona's cousin, Arthur Pendragon, and then he dies for the final time. I don't really enjoy this scene. In small pieces, it's very clever and funny, but altogether, it feels way too much. Maybe that's the theme of this movie's subpar issues. It's too much. I can forgive the 30 seconds of Shrek and the royal butt scratcher going at it. This is a kid's movie after all, and there wasn't anything super serious happening around the scene anyways. But the double death fake out is simply egregious. The first one is not needed. It's placed randomly and everything good the first death does. Second one does so much better and it works really well within the context of the whole scene. It comes right after the dramatic reveal of Fiona's cousin being Arthur Pendragon of legend. And then Harold passes for good a few seconds after the fake out. Harold was a shitty dad, but he didn't deserve his death to be tarnished by a lowbrow, over the top double death fake out. This is the first example of Shrek the Third not being able to walk the tightrope between adult emotions and kids' enjoyment, and is a very startling highlight. The setting is gloomy, the topic is heavy, someone is dying, and everyone is crying. It's okay to ground this scene a little bit, you know? With Harold's death setting the tone, we transition to his funeral, a scene that does balance somberness with very slight humor, but also raises questions about his song choice. There isn't much to visually describe besides that the kingdom is clearly in mourning as Harold is set adrift upon a man-made pond. His coffin, a medieval-style wooden footlocker shoebox, and frogs are singing Paul McCartney's Live and Let Die. The shoebox seems mean to Harold, but it's a good way, along with the singing frogs, to add light touches to an otherwise grim scene. The balance works well. However, most critics point out the song choice itself as a shortcoming. Live and Let Die was originally written for a James Bond movie and is, in fact, about espionage and killing people. If the song had continued in the scene for an extra 5 seconds, its Bond-like intensity would have made the tonal mismatch even more glaring. However, I've only ever heard the song in its entirety while writing this section of my script, and I assume most children watching Shrek the Third wouldn't grasp its true genre or creative context, given that it's a nearly 40 years older than the movie itself. While I understand and agree with the argument that a more fitting song could have enhanced the scene, I can't say it's as jarring for the typical 10-year-old viewer as it might be for a movie critic. But that leads to the questions. What were they going for here? Was the song a too clever juxtaposition, nodding to Harold's double life as a frog and king, while comedically winking at his assassination attempt on Shrek? And speaking of doubles, was his double death fake out also a play on this theme? Anyways, where was I? Oh, right. I can't help but wonder how a more thematically appropriate song might have elevated the scene, allowing it to fully embrace its emotional weight. As it stands, the choice is okay but ultimately unremarkable. It's a missed opportunity for something truly memorable. Though, interestingly, Disney's Meet the Robinsons, released the same year, also features singing frogs. Maybe 2007 was the year of the amphibian choruses. Coincidence? Probably. But it's fun to wonder if some frog related documentary was circulating in the early 2000s, subconsciously inspiring both studios. Anyways, While the funeral was somber, the tone takes a sharp turn as we move to a cliffside overlooking the castle, and we see Charming creepily watching the processions from afar before he turns his horse and goes to the poisoned apple. And this is one of the best scenes in the movie, but also one of the worst depending on how you look at it. Charming swaggers into the bar, and all the villains are glaring daggers at him. Sorry, fanfiction.net. They don't like him. He knows it, but he's calculating. He's pulling out all his charms and charisma. And despite having Hook's hook about to dice up his face, he ends up swaying the villains to his cause, pointing out all the inequalities and discrepancies between the good guys and the villains. And he promises them they're happily ever after. It's menacing, especially as the bar breaks out into a full blown brawl just for the hell of it. And the only comedic relief is the sudden appearance of fruity cocktails in everyone's hands as they cheer for Charming's speech. The scene is so good for so many reasons. It perfectly showcases how evil and powerful Charming really is. I would say he has more charisma than his mother did, which is terrifying because he does not have her cunning and he does not lack in her cruelty. Every villain hates him for the same reason. His mother was the curator of their villain origin story as much as she was the writer of the fairy tale Happily Ever Afters for the princesses. A quick recap of my Shrek 2 analysis of the fairy godmother. FG confesses to Harold that she makes people fall in love all the time. Her potions can turn people into animals, give pigs wings, change a queen into a wicked witch, etc. As quoted by Puss, she is the largest producer of hexes and potions in the kingdom. She can also take back the transformations with a wave of her wand. This evidence points to FG being the unidentified witch that cursed Fiona. But not only that, she is the perpetrator and catalyst of every fairy tale story that's seen in this franchise. So, for every princess the fairy godmother cursed, one of these people in this bar were turned into the villain of said princess's story, ultimately leading to their assumed impoverished lifestyle they are living when Charming struts through the door. And they know his mother did this to them. But through his pure charisma and charm, he makes them forget that and rallies them to his side. His charms are so effective, he says, once upon a time, someone decided we were the losers. It's so good. He's using his mother's words, twisting them a little bit, and now the villains are eating out of his hands. And then he uses his mother's famous promise to seal the deal, the gift of the villains happily ever after. And the bar fight that follows around him is such a fantastic way to foreshadow the chaos his charisma can sow in the people around him. It's just so brilliant. The only downside being the emotional tone this scene sets up is never explored, and it leaves such a bittersweet taste once you realize this. So, with Charming's villainy fresh in our minds, we switch to a more lighthearted venue with waves and a Viking boat. This next scene starts off with some funny moments to help break up the tension of the last scene, with the three blind mice falling down the stairs, the adult humor of the revelation that Puss is in fact a really big player, and there's a really lovely moment between Donkey and Dragon that really cements how much they love each other, while also being visually funny seeing a donkey and a dragon interact like that. And the family moment between Donkey and his kids is the perfect segue to Fiona attempting to tell Shrek that she's pregnant. Shrek is not understanding Fiona's not very subtle hints, and before she can tell him, he gets on the boat. Fiona is emboldened by Donkey's kids writing, "We love you, Dad," in the sky and yells across the water to Shrek that she's pregnant. Shrek, shocked, struggles to say, "Oh, that's great!" It's a really well done scene that does a lot in a short amount of time, especially in the end. The silly moments help to disperse the tension from the scene before, while giving levity to the emotional weight of Fiona's confession and Shrek's not very enthusiastic reaction after. We are also finally given Shrek's biggest challenge in the movie, him tackling his future as a father. And it is his biggest challenge, as unlike his adversity towards kingship, which is being addressed with the quest for Arthur, there is no fixing his future as a father. Unless he decides he's going to make good on his promise to Fiona that it's just going to be the two of them in the swamp and hits her with persuasion and reason right in the womb. Though we know he would never actually consider doing that. So, jokes aside, this is a great thematic evolution from the first two movies. The story of Shrek has always been to answer the question, what would happen if an ogre fell in love with a fairy tale princess? He met her, married her, won over the acceptance of his in laws, the kingdom, and himself. He discovered he is someone who is more than just an ogre, and now he has to come to terms with being a father, a brand new title he never thought he would ever wear. We also see how Donkey and Puss will reprise their roles as his dual processing mechanic, or his angel and his devil on his shoulders. Again, visually, they are on either side of Shrek during this scene, and Donkey is ecstatic that he's going to be an uncle, shouting, "I'm gonna be an uncle!" Like how a soon to be father would yell, "I'm gonna be a father!" in a stereotypical rom com. Meanwhile, Puss gets the adult humor crack of telling Shrek that he's royally fucked, with F bomb being blared out by the ship's horn. They are representing the dual emotions going through Shrek's head at the moment, overjoyed at expanding his family further, and overwhelming fear that he will fail at being a father because he is an ogre, which we can see more directly in the next scene. We see night falls and Shrek is having a dream. We don't know it's a dream for a few seconds, but we can quickly catch on to it when we see Shrek's house and we don't see Puss and Donkey. And I like the foreshadowing at the beginning that this is going to be a nightmare, a dark, foggy night, gloomy shadowed trees, and what seems like an imminent shipwreck, despite the tone of the scene being cheerful as we are getting concrete knowledge that this is in fact a dream. It's a fun, spiraling form of storytelling that also heavily represents the duality surrounding Shrek. As Shrek enters the house, the tone quickly shifts back to the nightmare and a baby carriage rolls on screen, spotlight on it. The use of camera angles is really well done, bringing us back into a scarier vibe along with the music, and it calls back to the intense close-ups of found footage horror movies like The Blair Witch Project. Shrek approaches the baby ogre, charmed but hesitant, cracking his classic better out than in joke when it burps. And then Shrek is sprayed with projectile vomit. It's gross, but younger me found it funny, so I'll let it slide. More babies are starting to come out of nowhere, and Shrek struggles to keep them all unharmed as they fall off of various places and handle various dangerous items like a lit match. And as a literal tumbling flood of babies comes pouring into the room, Shrek tries to run away, eventually making it to the door. And then he appears naked in front of hundreds of babies, all laughing at him at his high school or college graduation. Not to point out something obvious, but the World War Z style of a flood of babies isn't just absurd. It's a comedically exaggerated reflection of Shrek's overwhelming fears. The sequence perfectly captures his spiraling anxieties, and he wakes up in a cold sweat, calling out to Donkey to tell him about the dream. But Puss and Donkey's heads have been replaced with the visage of one of the baby ogres, and Donkey makes a bunch of baby noises before menacingly saying, "Da da!" And Shrek wakes up, for real, screaming. I would too. I do not blame him. This next part is brilliant as Donkey comes over to Shrek singing, and Shrek asks for him to cut to the part where he makes him feel better. Puss, being the devil on Shrek's shoulder, offers him an escape from reality for a few weeks to come to terms with being a father. Donkey, being Shrek's emotional developer, tries to get to the bottom of Shrek's negative feelings, and Shrek offers them up heartily. There's no hesitation on his part, or for Donkey to need to force it out of him by constantly pestering him. Shrek's not only showing his own developed emotional maturity, but he is also recognizing Donkey's interpersonal wisdom and is now actively seeking it out. It's really cool to see this continuation of Shrek's development in his and Donkey's relationship laid out so plainly. Donkey says, "Having kids isn't going to ruin your life." And Shrek replies, "It's not my life I'm worried about ruining, it's the kids." And he continues by confessing his insecurities due to his title as an ogre. And this next bit is why I say we all need to strive to be a friend like Donkey. He hears Shrek's worries and doesn't try to offer solutions or pander to him with kind words. He simply confirms that he hears what Shrek is saying, understands his fears, and offers himself and Puss's unfaltering assistance and friendship. It's beautiful and very ahead of its time, especially as it's a very emotionally vulnerable moment between two male characters. And I'm actually realizing it now, but Shrek and Donkey's friendship is all about emotional vulnerability and honesty, which in the context of the early 2000s, that was nearly unheard of happening in media between two straight male characters. And something interesting about the dream sequence is how it highlights the fallacies of Shrek's argument with Donkey. When have you ever heard the phrase, "as sweet as an ogre," or "as nurturing as an ogre," or even, "have you met my dad? You'll love him. He's a real ogre." In the dream, Shrek lets himself be charmed by the baby, and when the baby starts crying, he moves to comfort it. And when the other babies start appearing and are about to hurt themselves, he is there catching them and pulling them out of harm's way. It's amazingly clever that they showcase Shrek's inherent paternal instincts before he claims he fears he won't be a good dad. It makes the audience become Donkey in a way, making us root for Shrek to understand that he does not have to worry about being a bad dad. He's already proven he's got the basics down. Though there is a moment coming up that shows he still has plenty of room to grow. After Shrek's vivid nightmare, we find our trio arriving at Worcestershire High. This location sets a drastically different tone, bringing humor back to the forefront with its clever subversions of high school tropes. From the moment they nearly get trampled by a carriage school bus, the setting becomes a playground for comedic commentary. I talked about this scene during my intro when discussing the humor of this movie, but the comedy really is at its peak subversion here in Worcestershire. Why do I keep writing that name in the script? I'm going to say it wrong so many times. There are so many little details that are so well done. The potheads hotboxing frankincense and myrrh, the jocks being the jousting team, even them calling out how nerds are often bullies themselves. Guilty. It's so much fun. The trio eventually make their way to the jousting field where they think they find Arthur, but it's actually Lancelot. He's a cocky jackass, but he points them to the real Arthur who flees before they can catch up. Donkey gets stuffed into a locker at some point, and the students who did that run away from Donkey to a school assembly. The trio say they are part of a mascot contest that's happening during the assembly, and they have a pretty funny slapstick humor that's reminiscent of the Three Stooges, and they get in. As they walk in, they ask the assembled student body to reveal Arthur Pendragon. They all point above and behind Shrek, and sure enough, Artie is suspended by his tunic on the basketball hoop. A little subversion that was foreshadowed a few minutes earlier is the nerds did it, not the jocks. Artie falls, and Shrek tells him he's the new king of Far, Far Away after the students and the teachers chant for Shrek to eat him. What is this place? What did Artie do? If he constantly made really embarrassing speeches like he does before leaving with Shrek, then I could see why he was bullied in high school. I'd probably also bully him. Not actively like the nerds, but I would be chanting for him to be eaten along with everybody else. Besides the comedy and subversion of classic high school drama tropes and cliches, there isn't much going on to analyze in these scenes that won't be better talked about later, like Shrek's lie about Artie being the only heir, the two characters' similar backstories of being social outcasts, and Artie's angsty teenage speech, marking the beginning of his journey as a new king. While Artie and Shrek's journey unfolds, the narrative shifts back to Far, Far Away, where Fiona and the princesses are enjoying a brief moment of calm during her baby shower. This lighthearted gathering offers a stark contrast to the chaos Charming is orchestrating, setting the stage for the convergence of the two storylines. This is the official start of the B-plot in this movie. Unlike Shrek 1 and 2, where the villain moved either off-screen or in small 2-minute scenes, half of Shrek the Third is dedicated to watching the villains. Now you might be thinking, isn't the B-plot about Fiona and the princesses? Unfortunately, that's not the case. While Fiona and the princesses take up a significant amount of screen time, the true focus of the B-plot is Charming's rise and his deepening menace. This narrative decision reframes the structure of the movie, placing more emphasis on the antagonist than previous entries did. However, this comes at the cost of sidelighting Fiona's group, who often feel like tools to amplify Charming's actions rather than fully realized characters in their own right, which is disappointing to say the least, especially given the comedic lineup of their voice actors. The princesses begin talking about what happens after the baby is born, and we see how burnt out these princesses are, even though none of them actually have children. I wonder if this is an intentionally shown consequence of FG's manipulations. Cinderella, Snow White, and Sleeping Beauty are the first princesses listed by FG during her rant about ogres, and they are the ones who look the most broken during the scene. Cindy is jumpy and easily distracted. Beauty is constantly sleeping despite her curse being lifted, and Snow's personality could be described as jaded, or like she's overcompensating for something, saying, I got you the biggest present because I love you the most. The fairy godmother's confession in Shrek 2 offers insight into these lingering effects. She all but openly admits to cursing princesses and casting hexes to manufacture the perfect happily ever after narratives. The potions and spells she used to manipulate these princesses' lives didn't just impact their stories, they shaped their entire identities. And even in death, her actions have left a lasting mark, raising the unsettling question, can these fairy tales ever truly break free from the strings she's attached? And there's an intriguing moment of banter near the end of the scene that feels like an internal conversation the writers are having with the audience. The princesses, despite not having children themselves, list all the problems and negatives of their happily ever after. Their tone is jaded, reflecting a disillusionment with the fairy tale idea they once embodied. Meanwhile, Doris, who exists outside the traditional fairy tale princess narrative, counters with a hopeful perspective, saying, this baby is only going to make their marriage stronger. This exchange seems designed to provoke the audience into reflecting on societal views of marriage and parenthood. Doris represents an optimistic, perhaps idealized view of the transformative power of having children, while the princesses embody a more cynical outlook, shaped by the dissonance between expectations and reality. The tension between these perspectives invites viewers to consider who is correct. Is Doris's hopefulness a naive belief in the fairy tale narrative, or did the princesses represent an overcorrection rooted in dissatisfaction? This exchange cleverly invites the audience to reflect on the conflicting societal views surrounding marriage and parenthood, adding a deeper layer to the seemingly lighthearted baby shower. However, the levity is short lived, as Dragon suddenly senses its danger and sounds the alarm, marking the abrupt and dramatic shift to Charming's raid on the castle, followed by the sacking of the city. It's pandemonium. Dragon is instantly negated with a giant iron net. The city is destroyed within minutes, and Charming is in the castle and is on his way to capture Fiona before the princesses can even truly react. They narrowly escape, Gingy and crew staying behind to hold off Charming. Dragon being taken out immediately was a great move on the writer's part, as she's too powerful a player to be on the board for very long. She would destroy most of the tension in the scene if she was allowed more time to attack, because her fire would eliminate the threat instantly. The scene of Charming confronting Gingy and crew is annoying but brilliant at the same time. It's almost weird how well it's done. Gingy is singing after having his life flash before his eyes, and Pinocchio is trying to use clever wordplay to lie without lying, but it's just him talking himself in circles. The sensory experience of this scene is almost intolerable. However, the writers know how annoying this scene is when one of the pigs screams that he can't take it anymore and confesses where Shrek is. Timing is perfect. The scene doesn't overstay its welcome, as the pig cracks right before the audience would, and the meta joke is funny enough that the payoff is worth it. At the beginning of the raid is where the writers needed to shuck off Charming's silly comedy. He is declaring their pillaging in the name of the villain's happily ever after. Again, he's cribbing his mother's words and is now using them as a war cry. It's terrifying to see how far he's come since the low budget play. But then, he chokes on a fly. In one instance, the commanding presence he built is reduced to a joke, and the menace of the moment evaporates. Imagine if this had been handled differently, if Charming's charisma had remained intact throughout the film. His transformation from a perceived loser to a ruthless usurper would have mirrored Shrek's journey toward reluctant but genuine leadership. The contrast between them would have elevated the stakes, emphasizing the dangers of unchecked ambitions versus reluctant responsibility. Instead, the writers couldn't trust the existing humor to keep the tone light and undercut him at every turn, robbing the audience of a truly memorable villain. And maybe this is the biggest problem with Shrek the Third. After all, a hero is a hero, but everyone loves a good villain. And they couldn't let Charming be that villain. While we ponder that, let's get back to Shrek and company as they navigate back to Far, Far Away, and navigate the emotions of their new crown prince. And I really want to look at these next scenes as they are incredibly layered. The narrative subtly begins to draw parallels between Shrek and Artie, showing how much they share in terms of their personal struggles. Both characters have been ostracized by society for traits they can't control. Shrek for being an ogre, and Artie for being labeled a loser. These external judgments have shaped their self-perception and, by extension, their personalities. The weight of these labels mirrors the isolation they've experienced, making their eventual growth and bond all the more compelling. As the scene unfolds, we also see how Artie reflects Shrek's archetype as reluctant leader. When Donkey and Puss casually reveal that being a king isn't all about parties and princesses, but rather involves immense responsibility, Artie visibly panics and tries to turn the ship around. Instead of embracing the role, he's willing to return to his high school life, a place where he was bullied and humiliated. This moment is especially fascinating because it feels like an acknowledgement of a psychological truth. Abuse victims sometimes return to familial environments, even harmful ones, because familiarity can feel safer than the unknown. Artie knows, logically, that a life as a king offers opportunities and freedoms he never had in high school. However, the fear of uncertainty looms large. The weight of responsibility, the prospect of being constantly under scrutiny, and the inherent risks of leadership, assassins, politics, intrigue, usurpers, all feel overwhelming. At the same time, kingship would give Artie something he's never had: control over his destiny. This internal conflict highlights his initial reluctance and underscores how much growth he still needs to undergo before he can truly embrace his potential. And then there's the duality of Shrek's behavior. Remember, his journey is about coming to terms with fatherhood. In this scene, he's showing his inherent ability to empathize with a younger person, especially someone like Artie whose life parallels his own, by being the only one to recognize Artie's panic despite Donkey and Puss arguably being more emotionally mature than Shrek. But despite his empathy towards Artie, he decides to lie and then bully Artie. It's interesting that Shrek mirrors Charming in this moment, stealing the MO of the fairy godmother, but instead of her promises, it's her bullying tactics. He calls Artie a loser, the title that defined his life up until Shrek showed up and told him he could exchange it for the title of king. This showcases how Shrek is still very selfish, willing to put his own desires above Artie's comfort, and it shows that Shrek has plenty of room to grow before the kids come. After calling Artie a loser while wresting the ship's wheel from his hands, Shrek ends up breaking the wheel and they wreck against a random shore. And Artie and Shrek are still fighting even as they drag themselves onto the sand. There's a moment where we see Shrek project onto Artie his own insecurities, saying, "Hey, if you think this is going to get you out of anything, it isn't. We're heading back to far, far away, one way or another, and you're going to be a father." I think this is where Shrek begins to see how Artie's reluctance to be a king is similar to his own feelings about being a father, and he tries to make amends in a very misguided, but ultimately hilarious way. He begins to use teenage slang at Artie to try and relate to him and apologize at his own level. I'm not going to be quoting him, don't ask me to. And honestly, this scene is what makes the humor in this movie a notch above Shrek 2, as it's such a universal experience for parents to try and use current slang words to seem cool, or as my mom would like to say, still hip with it. Artie's reaction is accurate to every teenager whose parent does this to them, wanting to run away and scream, "Help! I've been kidnapped by a monster that's trying to relate to me!" It's classic, and Shrek uses so many different 90s and early 2000s slang compared to the typical one or two thrown into a sentence at the wrong time. He does a continuous stream of them that makes the scene the perfect amount of over the top. Bear with me for this next page or so. These are the last brilliant scenes of the movie, and I want to savor them. Artie runs to a hobbit house in the middle of the woods, and we meet Merlin, an eccentric, retired professor that plays off the woo-woo hippie archetype. I love Merlin. He's a silly little treat here, and he's even better at bringing out buried emotions than Donkey, which elevates him above the role of a typical comedic relief character and makes him an integral part of Shrek the Third's emotional narrative. This is a callback to the first Shrek movie, as Donkey is also a subversion of the comedic relief archetype by being more important than adding a handful of laughs in a comedy movie. Merlin's tactics are a bit more straightforward than Donkey's annoy them until they give you what they want approach. He openly comments on Shrek's self-destructive rage spiral after Shrek yells at Artie that he is going to be king, and Merlin forces the group to stay for a smoke therapy session. I really don't know how else to describe what Merlin is doing. He throws a magical substance in a fire that allows everyone to see their truths in the smoke. Shrek sees a baby carriage, of course, but he lies in the moment about seeing a unicorn. Then it's Artie's turn. And we get a really good allegory of a baby bird being abandoned in the nest too young and falling before it learns to fly. It's an external visualization of Artie's internal struggles with abandonment, self-doubt, and his feelings of underpreparedness for his new title as king. The baby bird motif is well worn to the point of being a cliche, but the writers do a fantastic job using it here. The moment walks the line between adult themes and a kid's movie perfectly, as it feels dramatic, but the cut-tos of Merlin and his hand drum are enough to give the scene levity. Shrek's fatherly archetype shifts quite a bit in these few minutes. First, he takes the high expectation slash self-projecting father archetype both on the beach and in front of Merlin's place, using the classic lines of "No more Mr. Nice Guy" and "You get your Royal Highness so far, far away or I'll kick it there." And in between, he tries to be the overcompensating father, pandering to Artie in a disingenuous way. But after Artie's vision, Shrek opens up to Artie. He no longer relies on an archetype to try and interact with him. He's just Shrek at this moment, and he, in far less words than I do, explains his journey of self-acceptance and how he's learned to trust he is more than the titles society has thrust upon him. He connects with Artie by being vulnerable and candid about his struggles, and the scene is simply lovely and well done. The humor is mature and gentle and keeps the tone so balanced. I could talk about the brilliance of this scene for hours. But unfortunately, this is where the emotional narrative of the film takes a back seat, replaced by the action-packed spectacle and a rush to resolve the storyline. You see, as we shift over to Fiona and company, it's at this moment that the A and B plots come together. While these sequences are entertaining, they primarily serve to bring the character arcs to a satisfying close rather than deepening the film's themes. That said, there are still moments worth exploring, so I'll focus on key highlights as we head into the final act. Fiona and the princesses are walking a vast sewer system beneath the palace as Fiona is trying to figure out a plan. They make it out of the sewer and are portrayed by Rapunzel, who has been very antagonistic for most of her screen time, so it doesn't come as a surprise when she and Charming kiss. I don't know if she was supposed to be a twist villain or not, and if she was, they didn't land the surprise factor very well. Before the princesses are taken away, Charming says, "You'll be back where you started, scrubbing floors or locked away in towers. That is, if I let you last the week." This chilling threat is undermined by Rapunzel calling him Pookie immediately after, and him calling himself Daddy. They do let the scene finish with another menacing threat from Charming, though, claiming Shrek is doomed when he gets to far, far away. I can't help but feel like the story of the first act and the story of the second act were never intended to intermingle the way they do. The opening teases a dark, more subdued, and ultimately deeper storyline, punctuated by the sinister clouds in the first frames, the somber hero montage song, and the loss of King Harold within the first 5 minutes. The movie gives all the signs that it will tackle themes of fatherhood, loss, and Shrek's continued journey of self acceptance. And Charming's potential for sociopathy could have made him one of the most compelling villains in the franchise, a chilling character study of toxic masculinity, even a parody of American Psycho. Instead, while the movie touches on these themes, it never fully delivers on the promise of his opening scenes. So, what went wrong? Did the writers not trust their story to be compelling enough? Or were executives micromanaging to broaden the movie's appeal? Unfortunately, there's no clear evidence either way. But it's easy to tell from the opening scenes, the moments of brilliant warmth throughout the first act, and the finale dance party that this movie was supposed to be something entirely different from the mediocrity we got. But let's get back to our heroes. Shrek wakes up and the gang is immediately attacked by Hook and his goons. The fight scene is really well choreographed, and I like the mockumentary style of camera work that they use during this scene. It adds a great comedic flair along with the absurdity of Merlin and Hook playing the piano during the fight. After Shrek and company win, Artie convinces Merlin to use his magic to get to Far, Far Away instantly. It's so clever how these small moments show how quickly Artie is adapting to the possibility of kingship, and it demonstrates how he has all the markings of being a good king. He just needed someone, Shrek, to believe in him. After Artie talks the city guards into allowing Shrek and company backstage, we see Charming straight up killing people as he's preparing for his stage show execution of Shrek while wearing pink leg warmers for seemingly no reason. Well, no, there is a reason. It's to add levity to an otherwise brutal scene. But there are so many silly things happening around Charming, like the trees practicing like ballerinas and the bodies being pulled off screen only to be replaced by another reluctant victim. Charming didn't really need the leg warmers to keep the scene balanced. And after leaving the stage, Charming is confronted by Shrek in his dressing room. But before Shrek can break his legs, guards appear and hold Artie, Donkey, and Puss hostage. Charming threatens to kill Artie for being the next heir, and Shrek tells him Artie isn't the next heir in order to save Artie's life. And now we have something to talk about. Earlier in the movie, Shrek's lies are often rooted in selfishness, such as his false claim that Artie is the only heir to the throne, and that being a king is fun and games. These lies are motivated by Shrek's desire to avoid the responsibility of leadership himself. It's a decision driven by fear and self preservation, and it sets up much of the tension between Shrek and Artie's relationship. However, in this climactic scene, Shrek flips the pattern on its head. Instead of wielding lies to shirk responsibility, he uses the truth to protect Artie. By confessing that he is the rightful heir, Shrek removes Artie from the equation, shielding him from Charming's wrath and danger. This act is profoundly self sacrificing, as Shrek knowingly puts himself in harm's way to safeguard Artie's future. What's even more compelling is how Shrek mixes truth with the harsh language he once used in anger. Earlier in the film, Shrek's frustrations with Artie leads him to lash out in words that highlights Artie's insecurities, reinforcing the loser label Artie already struggles with. Here, Shrek repurposes those same harsh words, but not to wound, he uses them strategically to convince Artie to leave and stay safe. It's a brilliant narrative reversal that shows how far Shrek has come in his journey. This moment also marks the near completion of Shrek's arc regarding his fatherhood. Throughout the movie, Shrek's fear of fatherhood stems from his belief that he lacks the qualities necessary to nurture and protect someone else. But in this scene, Shrek demonstrates the selflessness and bravery that defines true parenthood. By prioritizing Artie's well being over his own safety, Shrek proves not only to Artie but to himself that he is capable of being a protector and a guide, a father figure. The circular storytelling is subtle. Shrek begins the film avoiding responsibility through the deceit, but he ends it by embracing responsibility through truth and self sacrifice. This symmetry reinforces one of the film's central themes: growth comes not from avoiding challenges, but from facing them head on and learning to put others above yourself, or rather, fatherhood or parenthood. Unfortunately, this thematic thread doesn't carry us strongly into the final act, but let's see how the story progresses. After Artie leaves, we get a short montage of Artie abandoning Far, Far Away, Shrek being shackled, and Fiona in prison. What follows is the princess's escape, a scene that feels like it was aiming for something profound but never quite lands. Fiona finds out from Puss and Donkey, now body swapped, a gag that adds little beyond some visual humor, that Charming plans to kill Shrek during his play. When Fiona tries to rally the princesses to action, they assume the position, falling into submissive damsel-like poses. Sleeping Beauty is literally sleeping, Snow White's in her coffin pose, and Cindy is scrubbing the floor still. It's ironic that Fiona, who once waited in tower for her own rescue, now criticizes their victim mentality without recognizing her own past behavior. Snow White's retort spells out their doubt. We're three super hot princesses, two circus freaks, a pregnant ogre, and an old lady. What can we possibly do? In response, Queen Lillian literally headbutts a wall, creating an opening for their escape. While this moment is funny, it feels like a missed opportunity. Imagine if Queen Lillian had delivered a rousing speech about taking control of their destinies, emphasizing a collective strength and resilience. With Julie Andrews' commanding voice, this could have turned a funny but superficial moment into a defining one, reinforcing themes of empowerment. Instead, we get a rushed montage of buzzword femininity, Cinderella sharpening her glass slippers, Snow White revealing a tattoo, Beauty tearing her skirt, and someone burning their bra. It's a fun visual, but it leans too heavily on tropes to feel meaningful. Despite this, certain moments shine. Snow's ability to charm woodland creatures, quickly turning them feral with the immigrant song, is comedic gold. It's clever, unexpected, and perfectly captures the Shrek franchise's penchant for twisting fairy tale conventions. And then they switch the song over to Barracuda with no transition, and the gold is lost. The scene would have played out better if they had one dedicated song to it. And no doubts, Just Girl would have fit so thematically. They could have used Gwen Stefani's Woes to make the animals go feral, and it was sitting right there in 1995. But speaking of music, after a quick moment with Puss and Donkey telling Artie why Shrek said what he said, the scene transitions to Charming on stage. There's no comparing the villain's finale song in Shrek 2 and Shrek the Third. It wouldn't be fair. I've been on record saying that FG's performance is the single greatest musical finale in any movie ever, and I stand by that position. However, Charming's musical is supposed to be as bad as it is. We know this because of how the audience is reacting to Charming Rapunzel. They're actively cringing during the performance. Charming hits a note so pitchy that it shatters the glass in the audience. But that leads to the question of, why did the writers make it this bad? It's not laziness. The quality of the set design, its grandeur and eccentricities are wonderfully animated, and there are thousands of little details to comb through. So that leads me to believe it's an attempt to do something complex in the storytelling. By having this big musical scene, it's both a parallel to the very opening of the movie, showing that despite how successful his coup d'etat was, Charming hasn't grown or changed since we first saw him. And the scene also inverts FG's final performance, showing that despite Charming's desire to emulate his mother, evidenced by his echoing of her famed promises, he will never measure up to her. He is too insecure and his fury is too strong. While this performance underscores Charming's inability to fill his mother's shoes, it also sets the stage for the chaotic final confrontation. And Shrek quickly learns how to push Charming's buttons when he makes a snide remark at Charming's singing and sees Charming's swagger vanish. Shrek keeps bullying Charming until Charming goes for the kill, but as he raises his sword, Dragon melts it with her fire breath. As that the final battle is underwhelming. All of the good guys show up, visually spoofing classic "Heroes Assemble" style of entrance. Then Charming snaps his fingers and the bad guys swarm, instantly capturing everyone. Oh, how this scene would have been so much better if there was even a little tussle, like just a couple of minutes, just like 2 minutes, and everyone can ultimately get captured anyways again. Especially with the mockumentary style filming that they had earlier in the movie, it could have been so good. Why didn't they go over the top here? Of all places to not go over the top and be demure. Anyways, Charming goes to kill Shrek again, but is interrupted by Artie. Artie gives a speech. A talking tree checks his privilege, which is hilarious. But ultimately, Artie's words get to the villains and they let everyone go. His speech is well done. It's a tender moment in the film, and he's using Shrek's own words to sway the villains, though its spoon feeding of the movie's themes is disappointing. In a final ditch effort to get the throne, Charming tries to kill Artie, and Shrek stops him with his chains. Charming turns the blade on Shrek, and it looks like he does stab Shrek, but we quickly find out Shrek was acting as he winks to Artie and Fiona, and he grabs Charming and lifts him up. And Charming says, "This was supposed to be my happily ever after." And Shrek says the most badass line in the whole movie. "Well, I guess you're gonna have to keep looking, because I'm not giving up mine." And then Dragon coyly tips a tower on top of Charming, presumably unaliving him and adding another villain to her mile-long kill count. I will say the movie wraps up nicely enough. Shrek gives Artie the choice of being king, and Artie takes it. This scene neatly ties up both Artie and Shrek's developmental stories, highlighting how Artie is now more prepared and confident in taking the throne, and it showcases how Shrek has shucked off the selfishness he displayed towards Artie earlier in the movie, and rounds out the last of his arc. And after all of the spectacle, Shrek the Third brings us back to the swamp, where it all began. And what's a Shrek movie without a finale dance party? But this one is different. The whole gang is there, even Queen Lillian, as the babies have been born. Everyone is less dancing and more moving harmoniously with each other, as they do typical parenting things like changing diapers, feeding, and enjoying each other's company. This was the only way they could have ended the movie, and they nailed it. It's such a great thematic evolution to the other movies' endings. It's matured, like Shrek has throughout the franchise, and it very cleverly mimics the realities of growing up and having children. Their shift in priorities has occurred. It's not about fun and games and having these big blowout celebrations. It's about the little moments of day to day activities that you enjoy with your loved ones. It's still a celebration, though simpler and more personally profound. Shrek the Third is a paradox. It's a film bursting with potential, packed with clever humor and heartfelt moments, but one that ultimately buckles under uneven storytelling and lack of narrative trust. The movie's reluctance to embrace its darker, more introspective tone keeps it from reaching the heights of its predecessors. However, it remains a solid piece of entertainment, particularly for its intended audience of children. And that brings me to my final thoughts. I want to make one thing clear. Shrek the Third is an amazing kids' movie. It's filled with heart and good comedy and silly moments, and ends with a touching message about self-empowerment that has probably shaped the lives of many young children. It does well what it sets out to do, providing a good hour and a half of laughs and many more laughs out on the playground, yelling, "Da da," as you jump scare your friend, or quoting any of Eddie Murphy's lines to make someone think you're the funniest person alive. My adult self, especially after all these hours of looking at the storytelling and picking apart these characters, can't see past the over the top sloppiness of it all. But my child self still remembers how much I loved this movie, and it would be unfair not to give the movie its flowers for that. Thank you so much for watching this video. I think I would have so much to say about Shrek the Third, but then again, I never think I have so much to say on any given topic, and then I find I've been rambling for over an hour. What did you guys think? How do you like Shrek the Third? Do my opinions and analysis inform your own opinions on the movie? I love to hear your thoughts in the comments. After this movie, I need a bit of a Shrek break, and I have a few projects I want to get started on and put out here into the world, so please be a lookout for them. And on a slightly related note, do you guys like tiered rankings or worst to best ranking videos more? I have a concept of an idea of a plan for one such video, but I want public consensus on the style I use. Let me know. Anyways, I'll finish this story later.